Welcome to TB Dahl Audiobooks. Before the story begins, please take a quick second to subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, enjoy the listen. This is an audiobook. Chapter 2, Part 2. Undisclosed Background. Author T.B. Dahl. Chapter 2, The Meeting. Continued. They took them out through the service corridor and up through the rear car park, separately. A uniformed officer walked beside each of them, not touching, not restraining, the careful distance of custodial guidance rather than arrest. The Oslo night hit her as she came through the service door. The rain had lightened to a mist that blurred the arc lights the police had set up in the car park, turning them into pale halos against the wet tarmac. 2 patrol cars and an unmarked vehicle were angled across the entrance. Beyond the tape that was already being strung between a concrete pillar and the side of the building, she could see the waterfront. Aker Brygge's lit facades reflecting in pieces on the black water. Cold air. The smell of rain on stone and of the fjord. She breathed it in deliberately. It was useful to breathe something real. Across the car park, she could see Elliot being walked toward a second vehicle, a different officer, the same formal distance. He moved without urgency, without any appearance of resistance or fear, and for a brief moment before they were separated by the angle of a patrol car, he looked back. Not at the building, at her. She held the look for the length of a step, then the car park geometry shifted, and he was gone. The officer beside her opened the rear door of a vehicle. Riley got in. The seat was firm and slightly damp from a previous occupant. The door closed. Through the window, the museum's stone exterior was visible at the edge of the light. Broad, heavy, sealed. The same building it had been at 2128. The same stone, the same glass. She looked at her hands in her lap. The police were treating them as witnesses. She understood what that meant and also what it didn't mean, and the distance between those two things was going to determine how much of the next several hours she could manage effectively. Her phone was in an evidence bag in a different car. Tara had asked what happened. Tara didn't know yet that the man who had handed Riley the envelope that morning was now lying on the floor of a museum basement, and that the police have Riley's phone, and that somewhere in the logic connecting all of those facts, there was a pattern she was only beginning to see the edges of. The vehicle started. The museum receded through the rear window, stone and rain and blue light, until a turn onto the main road took it from view entirely. The station was in the centre of Oslo, a short drive that felt longer because she was in the back of a police vehicle without her phone and with nothing to do but hold her thoughts in order. She organised them by category, the way she would have organised a risk briefing. What she knew. A man was dead. He had delivered her envelope that morning and was found inside the same building she had been sent to at the same time she was told to arrive. Someone signed the letters HR. The code worked. The basement existed exactly as described. The dead man had a note near his body that referenced a file number appearing in both envelopes. The handwritten scrap mentioned Brasovo, the estate of Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, the last male Romanov in the direct succession line, dead since 1918. What she didn't know, whether the dead man had sent the letters himself or been acting on someone else's instruction, whether HR was a person or an organisation, what File 17 designated, what the Northern Table was, what B4 referred to. Who else knew about the meeting? Why both she and Elliot Harper had received separate letters to the same location at the same time? What she suspected, but could not confirm, that R17 and E17 referred to her and Elliot personally. That the meeting had been compromised before they arrived, as the note stated. That someone had used the meeting's compromise to reach the man before he could speak. What she was avoiding thinking about. The implications of Brasovo. She let that category sit at the edge of her thoughts and did not open it. The vehicle parked. The station had the particular atmosphere of a working bureaucratic institution at 2200 hours. subdued but not sleeping, with the specific tiredness of people on shift change and the fluorescent brightness that public buildings maintained regardless of hour. She was taken through a side entrance, past a duty desk and a corridor with grey industrial flooring, and into a room that held a table, 3 chairs, a camera mounted high on the wall, and a carafe of water with 2 cups. She was told that Detective Anders would be with her within 20 minutes. He arrived in 12. He came in without ceremony, set a folder on the table, sat down and looked at her. No coffee, no small talk. He had the energy of a man who found courtesy useful when it served a purpose and not otherwise. "Before we begin formally," he said, "I want to tell you something. The man in the museum basement, we've identified him provisionally through building records." Riley kept her expression neutral. "Already?" He was listed as a registered consultant with the museum's archival department, freelance, contracted for a documentation project. His name was Henrik Rask. He's 68 years old, Norwegian national. She let the name settle. Henrik Rask. She had not known his name before this moment and did not recognize it from anything she had encountered in her professional work. She would have remembered. Her memory for names was reliable, and she retained most of what she read. "I don't recognize the name," she said. "You've never had contact with him in any professional capacity?" "Not to my knowledge." Anders wrote something in the folder. "His access to the building's basement area is consistent with his contractor role. He would have had legitimate reason to be in the service corridors." He looked up. "What's not consistent is why he was there at 10:30 at night." "No." "Or why he sent letters to 2 strangers, instructing them to come there at that time." "We don't know that he sent them," Riley said. "The letters were signed HR. That could refer to an organization, a group, or another person." Anders looked at her for a moment. "Your letter was delivered by a man matching Rask's description. Grey-haired, dark coat, medium build." She had known this since she saw the body. She had not said it, had been waiting to understand whether the police were going to establish it themselves or whether she would need to address it directly. Anders had established it himself, which was both efficient and a signal about the quality of his thinking. "I noticed the similarity," she said. "I wasn't certain enough to state it as fact. He didn't speak to me, and I wasn't expecting to identify him at the end of the evening." "But you believe it was the same man?" A pause. "Yes, I believe so." Anders made another note. The room's fluorescent lighting was the same temperature as the basement corridor and slightly unkind to anything it fell on. The carafe of water sat untouched between them. "Ms. Hunt, you work as a geopolitical advisor, political risk consulting." "Yes." "Do you have clients or professional contacts with connections to Russia or Russian émigré communities?" The question arrived cleanly, without telegraphing. She had expected it to come eventually, but its precision told her that Anders had either read her professional background already or was sharper than his unhurried manner suggested. "My work covers a range of regions, including Russia and Eastern Europe," she said. "I advise clients on political risk, institutional behavior, regime analysis, election dynamics, sanctions exposure. It's analytical work, not operational. You're not involved in any diplomatic or intelligence-adjacent activity." "No." "No relationships with Russian opposition groups, émigré communities, or civil society organizations." "Professional contacts for research purposes, no formal relationships." She kept her tone accurate and unremarkable. "I study political systems. Russian politics is one area among many. Have you ever encountered the initials HR in a professional context?" She considered. "No." Anders looked at her. He had the quality of a man who was listening to what was said and separately listening to what wasn't, and she was aware of both channels operating simultaneously. "Mr. Harper told us he had no connection to Russian affairs," Anders said. "He works in construction engineering, former military." "We met tonight," Riley said. "I don't know his professional background in detail. But you compared notes in the basement before we arrived." "We were 2 people who had received identical letters and found a dead man. We spoke." And he mentioned nothing about Russia or HR in that conversation. He mentioned the same things I've mentioned to you: the letters, the code, the body. Anders closed the folder. Ms. Hunt, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd ask you to answer it in the same way. She waited. Is there anything about tonight that you understood, not suspected, but understood, that you haven't told me? The question was clean and precise, and she held it for exactly the length of time a person needed to take it seriously. No, she said. Elliot's interview room was identical in every practical respect. Same table, same camera position, same carafe, same overhead light that seemed to have been installed specifically for the purpose of making people look slightly unwell. The officer who had brought him in left the door open for a moment before closing it, and in that moment Elliot heard, at low volume, a brief exchange in the corridor. Two voices, one of them Anders and one he didn't recognize, discussing something they reduced to a murmur before the door shut. He couldn't catch the content. He sat and looked at the table and went through the evening again. Not his statement, he'd organized that already, and it was accurate and consistent and contained nothing that wasn't supported by physical evidence the police had already found. He went through the pattern instead, the way he used to review a terrain analysis before a mission, stripping out what he'd assumed and looking at what he'd actually observed. Observed. The dead man's position. He'd fallen or been placed near the wall. No obvious blood that Elliot had seen in the brief look he allowed himself before directing his attention to the room's other entry points. The man's coat was intact, no obvious signs of a struggle in the coat itself, which suggested he hadn't fought his way to the floor or hadn't been able to. Observed. The note near the body. Typed. Formal. Someone had composed it before arriving, or composed it on site before the situation deteriorated. Either way, premeditation. Observed. The sound from further in the basement. One scrape, no repetition. Long enough ago that whoever made it, if it was a person, had either exited through another access point or was still in the building somewhere behind the police perimeter. He had not mentioned the sound to the officers at the scene, partly because he wasn't certain enough to assert it, partly because reporting a possible third presence in the building would have prompted a search, and a search would have disrupted the basement before Elliot had a chance to understand its geography. He recognized that this was a decision a more cooperative person would not have made. He also recognized that a person who had spent time in situations where acting on incomplete information cost lives had reasons for the decision that went beyond obstruction. Anders came in without knocking. Elliot watched him sit and open the folder and go through the same ritual of settling without performing it as ritual. The detective had a particular quality that Elliot had clocked in the basement, an unhurried certainty that didn't derive from arrogance but from experience. This was a man who had learned to wait for things to become clear because he'd seen what happened when you pushed before they did. Elliot respected that, which was different from trusting it. Henrik Rask, Anders said. 68 years old, archival consultant, contracted to the museum. Does the name mean anything to you? No. You've never encountered him professionally or personally? Not that I know of. The man who delivered your letter, you described him as medium height, medium build, dark coat, not young. Rask matches that description. Yes. You didn't recognize him when you found the body? The light was poor and I was focused on confirming he wasn't responsive. I noted the build and the coat, but I wasn't in a position to compare. Anders wrote. You served in the Norwegian army? Officer, yes. International missions? 1. I'm not going to discuss the operational details of that deployment. The detective looked up, not with annoyance. I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking because your military background is relevant to how you handled the scene tonight. You didn't panic. You checked for a pulse and then moved to a defensible position at the doorway. Elliot said nothing. Most civilians would have left the building immediately or not entered the room at all. Miss Hunt called the police. I secured the doorway. We had no reason to go further into the basement, and we didn't. And you agreed to stay rather than leave. Leaving a scene where we'd found a dead man seemed like a decision that would be difficult to explain later. Anders studied him. You've handled dangerous situations before. I've managed construction sites with active structural risk and led personnel under conditions that required fast decision-making. Yes. A beat. Were you frightened tonight? The question arrived with the same cadence as the factual ones that had preceded it, which was either deliberate technique or genuine curiosity. Elliot turned it over. I was alert, he said. That's different. Anders made a note. Something in his expression shifted, not toward skepticism, not toward approval, simply toward a different register of attention. Mr. Harper, the letter you received instructed you specifically not to contact the police. He set the pen down. Why did you decide to stay and allow Ms. Hunt to call 112, given that instruction? Because the letter's instructions didn't anticipate a dead man. Elliot kept his voice level. The circumstances changed, acting as though they hadn't seemed worse. Worse for you legally. Worse in general. You and Ms. Hunt discussed this. We agreed quickly. It wasn't a long discussion. You'd known each other for approximately 10 minutes at that point. She was right, Elliot said. It didn't take long to recognize that. Anders looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man assembling a picture. I'm going to ask you something directly. Is there anything you observed or understood tonight that you haven't included in this conversation? Elliot met his eyes. The sound from the basement, the officer's reaction at the mention of File 17, his own certainty, building since he'd first read the letter on the construction site, that the E17 inside the flap was not a random designation. I want to be helpful, Elliot said, but I want to make sure I understand what I'm helping with before I share things I'm not certain about. The detective's expression didn't change. That's an interesting answer. I know. It's not a yes or a no. No, Elliot agreed. It isn't. Anders looked at him for another few seconds. Then he closed the folder and stood. Someone will come with a full written statement form within the next 20 minutes. Take your time with it. Be as specific as you can about times, descriptions, and sequences. Of course. The detective moved to the door. His hand was on the handle before Elliot spoke. Detective, the initials on the letters, H.R. Have you encountered them before in a case? Anders turned. The question sat between them in the fluorescent light. Why do you ask? Professional habit, Elliot said. I assess whether a reaction matches the information. When your officer mentioned File 17 in the basement, someone in the room responded to the words before they'd had time to assess the context. A pause. Anders's face offered nothing. I'll note your observation. The door closed behind him. Elliot sat alone in the interview room. The camera in the upper corner of the wall was active. He could see the small red indicator light. He kept his expression neutral and his hands on the table and thought about File 17 and the northern table and the weight of the handwritten word Brasovo in a dead man's break room. He thought about Riley Hunt, who had handled a detective's careful interrogation the way someone handled a professional briefing, controlled, accurate, and carefully bounded at the edges. He thought about the mark inside his envelope, E-17. R for Riley, E for Elliot. He was almost certain of it now. Not a filing category, a designation, a tracking marker inside a system that had known their names long before tonight. The statement form arrived at 11:20. He read it through twice before he began to write. They brought her phone back at 20 minutes before midnight. A uniformed officer set it on the table in front of her, along with a form confirming that the device had been held as potential evidence and was being returned without data extraction at this stage of investigation. She signed the form. The officer left. The phone had 11 messages from Tara. She read them in sequence. Riley, I'm serious. What happened, okay? You said police are coming. Are you at the museum? I looked up the National Museum address. Please tell me you're not inside. I'm going to call you in 5 minutes if you don't respond. Okay, I called and it went straight to voicemail. Either your phone is off or something happened and I need you to tell me which one. Riley, okay, I'm not sleeping. I'm just going to be awake until you tell me you're fine. I made tea. It's been 2 hours. Are they keeping your phone? Is that why you're not answering? I'm trying not to catastrophize. I am definitely catastrophizing. Still here. Please let me know you're okay when you can. The most recent message had come in 6 minutes ago. I'm going to assume that no news is okay news. I love you. Please be safe. Riley read the last one twice. The specific plainness of it. Tara did not overuse those words, which gave them their weight. She typed, I'm at the station. They had my phone. I'm okay. I'll call you tomorrow morning. Please go to sleep. The response came before she had put the phone down. Riley, I've had 4 cups of tea. You're at a police station. Are you under arrest? Witness, Riley typed. Not arrest. I'll explain everything tomorrow. Sleep. That is not reassuring, but okay. I'm going to bed. You better call me. Riley set the phone face down. The interview room had the particular quality of a space that was used and impersonal simultaneously. The carafe of water, the institutional lighting, the camera with its small red eye in the corner. She had been in this room, or in rooms identical to it, in imagination many times, playing out scenarios as part of risk briefing work. She had never expected to be sitting in one at midnight with her evidence-bagged envelope on the other side of a door and a dead man's name in her memory. Henrik Rask, 68, archival consultant. He had come to Tim Vendelbo that morning with a purpose, and the purpose had been to place a letter in her hand, and the letter had been designed to bring her to a specific location at a specific time, and he had been in that same location when she arrived, except that by then he was past the point of explaining anything. The question was whether he had sent the letters himself. If he had known they might kill him for it. If someone else had sent the letters, using his position to deliver them, the implications were different. He might have been killed for cooperating, or for refusing to cooperate, or simply for knowing too much. Either way, the meeting had been compromised before they arrived. The typed note said so. They know about the meeting. Which meant Rask had known the meeting was blown and gone anyway, which brought her back to Elliot's observation in the basement. That was what a man did when the warning mattered more than the risk. He had come to speak to them. He hadn't managed it. She looked at the camera. Someone was going to piece this together, and when they did, they were going to come back to her with sharper questions. The thing she needed before that happened was more time and more information, in proportions she currently couldn't calculate because she was sitting in a police station without her laptop, her files, or access to any database more sophisticated than her own memory. File 17 is open. She turned the phrase over. In organizational language, a file that was open could mean active, under review, in progress, or compromised. The note's context made compromise the most plausible reading. Something had been exposed, something that had previously been closed, protected, sealed, hidden, was now accessible to people it was not meant to be accessible to. And whatever that file designated had a number that matched the marks inside the envelopes. She and Elliot were in that file. The door opened, and a younger officer came in with a written statement form, explained the format briefly, left a pen, and told her there was no rush. She picked up the pen. She would write exactly what had happened, in the order it happened, with every detail she was certain of. She would not lie. She would not invent. She would be specific about the letters, the code, the body, the notes, and the sequence of events from 2128 to the moment the police arrived. She would not write Brazovo. She would not write Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. She would not write File 17 as anything other than a phrase on a note she had seen but not touched. And she would finish the statement and sign it and walk out of this building and find Elliot Harper. And they would sit down somewhere private and go through everything they had not said tonight, because she was increasingly certain that what they hadn't said was more important than what they had. She set the pen to the paper. She began to write. They released them at 12:47, not together. Elliot came through the station's side entrance at 12:41 and stood on the wet pavement outside, turning up the collar of his jacket against the mist. The air was cold and smelled of the city at this hour. Damp stone, residual traffic, the distant note of the fjord that reached most of the central neighborhoods when the wind was in the right direction. He stood there and waited. He didn't check his phone. He had switched it back on when the officer returned it and found several messages from a colleague about a delivery issue at the Bjorvika site, and one from a number he didn't recognize that had come in during the hours his phone was held and that contained only 6 characters. E. Safe? He had looked at the message for a long time before pocketing the phone. No name, no context, a number he had never stored. He filed it alongside the officer's reaction to file 17 and said nothing to anyone. At 12:47, the door opened and Riley came out. She walked out as she had walked into everything else he'd observed her do tonight. Controlled, upright, deliberate. But the control was doing slightly more work now. He could see it in the set of her jaw and in the way she looked at the pavement for one step before she looked up and oriented herself. She found him immediately. She crossed the wet pavement without hurrying. The street behind him was empty in both directions. A tram ran its overnight schedule somewhere nearby, invisible but audible as a brief metal sigh that came and went. "They have our statements," she said, stopping beside him. "They'll want us available for further questions." "I know." They identified Rask, archival consultant, contracted to the museum. "They told me as well." She looked at him, assessed something, looked away, up the street. "We need to talk." "Yes." He turned up his collar another degree. "Not here." "No." A pause. "Do you have somewhere?" He thought about his apartment in Sagana. Ordered, private, no uncontrolled access points he hadn't already catalogued. No connection to anything either of them had told the police tonight. "I have somewhere," he said. "All right." She pulled her coat around her. The mist had thickened slightly, not rain yet, but pressing toward it. The arc lights of the museum were invisible from here, but he could place the building's direction by geography and by the particular pattern of low-altitude light that gathered above illuminated structures in this part of Oslo at night. She seemed to know he was doing this. "The car park," she said quietly, not a question. "Yes." She nodded once, and then they started walking. The Oslo streets were quiet around them, the specific quiet of a city that maintained a nighttime presence without ever fully abandoning its Nordic reserve. A couple crossing a lit bridge ahead, a lone cyclist, the orange glow from a late-night grocery. Water on the tarmac caught and scattered the streetlights. They didn't speak until they reached the end of the first block. "The message I sent Tara," Riley said. "I told her the police were coming. I told her I was safe. I didn't tell her anything else." "I know. I saw you send it." "She knows I came to the museum tonight. She doesn't know about the body or about you." "She'll want to know." "She will." Riley adjusted her collar. "I'll tell her in the morning. Enough of the truth to satisfy her without putting her in the middle of something she has no way to navigate." Elliot thought about the message on his phone. E. Safe? The 6 characters that knew to use an initial rather than a name. "When you research Brasovo," he said. She glanced at him. "Yes." "Don't use your work systems." "I wasn't planning to. And not your personal laptop if it's connected to any cloud service or institutional account." She was quiet for a moment. "You know something I don't." "I know what it means when someone is methodical enough to get an access code, a time, and a location into our hands without any traceable communication. That kind of operational discipline doesn't exist at one end of the equation and nowhere else." He watched the road ahead. "Someone else has been methodical about the other things as well." The mist fell around them, soft and cold. "The marks in the envelopes," she said, not a question anymore. "Yes. R for Riley, E for Elliot." "I think so." She breathed out, not a sigh, a controlled release, the kind of breath that said, "I had been thinking this and needed to hear it said out loud before I accepted it as the territory we're standing in." "Then whatever file 17 is," she said, "we've been in it for a long time." "Since before tonight," Elliot agreed. The street opened ahead of them. The tram was visible now at the far end of the block, waiting at a stop with its lit interior casting warm yellow rectangles on the wet road. One person boarded. The doors closed. It moved on. "Sagana," she said, "left at the next junction." They walked. The story continues in the next chapter, so make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with fellow book lovers.